The sound of grinding metal echoed through Marina Castillo's workshop as she adjusted the torque on a stubborn carburetor, her calloused hands moving with the precision of someone who understood machines better than people. Outside, the Pacific coastal fog rolled through the streets of Seaview, Oregon, a town so small that most maps forgot to include it. Marina preferred it that way. Invisibility had become her greatest asset, and this forgotten corner of the world provided exactly the kind of anonymity she needed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 45, Marina had perfected the art of being unremarkable. Her black hair, streaked with premature silver, was always pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore the same uniform every day: steel-toed boots, dark jeans, and a navy blue work shirt with Castillo's Garage embroidered in fading yellow thread. The locals knew her as the quiet woman who could fix anything with an engine, from fishing boats to farm equipment, but who never spoke about her past or joined in the town's social gatherings. What they didn't know was that every morning at 5 a.m., before the town stirred to life, Marina would slip into the abandoned hangar behind her garage. There, hidden beneath rusted corrugated metal and overgrown blackberry vines, sat something that shouldn't exist: a fully restored F-16 Fighting Falcon, its engines maintained to military specifications and its avionics upgraded with technology that most air forces could only dream of acquiring. The jet had no tail numbers, no identifying markings, just a small lightning bolt painted on the cockpit door, symbol that once struck fear into enemy pilots across 3 different continents. Marina would run her hands along the aircraft's sleek fuselage like greeting an old friend, checking fluid levels and testing systems with the methodical care of someone who understood that perfection was the difference between life and death. For 12 years, she had maintained this double life. By day, she was Marina Castillo, the reliable mechanic who charged fair prices and minded her own business. By night, she was someone else entirely, someone whose real name was buried in classified files so deep that even she sometimes wondered if that person had ever truly existed. The transformation from celebrated fighter pilot to small-town mechanic hadn't been a choice. It had been survival. The people of Seaview had their theories, of course. Old Portuguese fishermen whispered that she'd fled an abusive husband somewhere back east. The pastor's wife was convinced Marina was running from gambling debts. A few of the younger locals speculated she might be in witness protection, though they could never agree on what crime she might have witnessed. None of them imagined that the woman who changed their oil and fixed their transmissions had once been considered one of the most dangerous pilots in the world. Marina's past began to catch up with her on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. She was deep under the hood of Pete Morrison's fishing boat engine when the sound reached her, a low thrumming that made her blood freeze. It was the distinctive whine of military-grade turbines, the kind that powered aircraft most civilians would never see. She slid out from under the engine compartment, wiping grease from her hands as her eyes scanned the overcast sky. 3 black helicopters appeared through the fog, flying in perfect formation at an altitude that suggested they were conducting surveillance rather than simply passing through. Marina recognized the aircraft immediately: modified UH-60 Black Hawks with enhanced sensor packages and communication arrays that could intercept cellular signals from miles away. These weren't Coast Guard helicopters or local law enforcement. These were the kind of aircraft that appeared when someone very important wanted someone else found. She forced herself to remain calm, continuing her work on the boat engine while tracking the helicopter's movement through her peripheral vision. They made 2 passes over the town before disappearing back into the coastal fog, but Marina knew they would return. After 12 years of carefully constructed anonymity, someone had finally connected Marina Castillo to the woman she used to be. That evening, as she locked up the garage, Marina noticed the first signs that her sanctuary had been compromised. A rental car with Washington state plates sat in the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, occupied by two men in business suits who seemed far too interested in their newspapers. The antique shop across the street had a new customer, a woman with the rigid posture of military training who spent an unusual amount of time examining vintage postcards while maintaining a clear view of Marina's garage. Marina's instincts, honed by years of combat missions and survival training, screamed danger. She completed her evening routine exactly as she had for the past 12 years, checking locks, setting security systems, and reviewing the day's receipts. Her mind was already shifting into a tactical mode she hadn't accessed in over a decade. The encrypted satellite phone hidden in her workshop safe buzzed once as she prepared to leave. Only 3 people in the world knew that number, and 2 of them were supposed to be dead. Marina stared at the device for a long moment before powering it on. The message was simple: Phoenix rising. The nest is compromised. Storm incoming. Raven. Raven, Colonel Sarah Chun, her former commanding officer and the only person alive who knew the complete truth about Marina's last mission. If Sarah was breaking 12 years of communication silence, something catastrophic was approaching. Marina's hands trembled slightly as she typed her response. Understood. Status? The reply came immediately. Commercial Flight 447 departing Seattle tomorrow, 6:47 a.m. 157 souls aboard. Weather system creating instrument failure. Standard pilots can't handle it. You're the only one. The implications hit Marina like a physical blow. Flight 447 would be a passenger jet, probably one of the larger aircraft that carried families, business travelers, and ordinary people who had no idea their lives hung in the balance. A weather system causing instrument failure meant the pilots would be flying blind through conditions that could tear an aircraft apart. Standard commercial pilots, no matter how experienced, weren't trained for the kind of precision flying required to navigate severe weather without instruments. But Marina wasn't a standard pilot. Before she became Marina Castillo, she had been Lieutenant Commander Elena Phoenix Rodriguez, one of only 7 pilots ever certified for Category X weather operations, flying missions in conditions so severe that most military aircraft were grounded. She had threaded fighter jets through hurricane-force winds, landed on aircraft carriers during storms that made seasoned sailors seasick, and once flew a damaged F-16 through a thunderstorm so violent that meteorologists later classified it as impossible to survive. Marina typed back, 12 years out of practice. There are others. Sarah's response was swift and brutal. All Category X pilots are either dead or missing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Weather Service confirms Category 5 atmospheric river, hitting coast tomorrow morning. Flight path goes directly through the worst of it. Pilots will lose instruments at 30,000 feet over open ocean. Without intervention, all 157 people aboard will die. Marina closed her eyes, feeling the weight of old responsibilities pressing down on her shoulders. She had walked away from this world for a reason. The missions, the secrets, the constant pressure of holding other people's lives in her hands, it had nearly destroyed her. She had chosen anonymity and simplicity over the adrenaline and purpose of military aviation because she needed to prove to herself that she could be more than just a weapon. But now 157 innocent people were going to die unless she became that weapon one more time. Her phone buzzed again. Marina Castillo can stay hidden, but Elena Rodriguez can save lives. The choice is yours, Phoenix. But know that if you don't act, their blood is on both our hands. Marina stared at the message for a long moment, then walked to the window overlooking her garage. 12 years ago, she had made a promise to herself that she would never again be responsible for death and destruction. She had built a quiet life fixing engines and serving a community that accepted her without questions. But the price of that peace might be 157 lives lost to a storm that she alone had the skills to navigate. She looked toward the hidden hangar where her F-16 waited in perfect readiness. The aircraft had been more than a machine to her once. It had been an extension of her will, a tool that allowed her to accomplish impossible things. But it was also a reminder of everything she had lost, everyone she had failed to save despite her skills. The decision crystallized in her mind with the clarity that had once made her the most feared pilot in 3 different conflict zones. Marina Castillo, the mechanic, would have stayed hidden and lived with the guilt. But Elena Rodriguez, Phoenix, had never learned how to let innocent people die when she had the power to save them. She typed her final message, "Coordinates for intercept?" Sarah's response included detailed flight plans, weather projections, and tactical assessments that painted a picture of an almost impossible mission. Flight 447 would lose communication and navigation systems while flying through the worst storm to hit the Pacific Northwest in decades. The aircraft would be flying blind through turbulence that could break it apart, with no way to navigate to safety and no possibility of emergency landing until the storm passed. Marina would need to reach the aircraft in her F-16, establish communication with the panicked commercial pilots, and guide them through the storm using visual reference points and her own navigation systems. She would essentially become their eyes and ears, leading a massive passenger jet through conditions that would challenge even her exceptional skills. The risk was enormous. If she miscalculated, if the weather was worse than predicted, or if her own aircraft failed, she wouldn't just be responsible for her own death. She would have given the 157 passengers false hope before leading them to destruction. But if she succeeded, she could guide them to safety and disappear back into anonymity before anyone realized what had happened. Marina spent the next hour making preparations with the methodical precision of someone who understood that details meant survival. She programmed flight plans into her F-16's navigation computer, checked weather patterns from multiple sources, and calculated fuel requirements for a mission that would push both her aircraft and her skills to their absolute limits. The storm system approaching the coast was massive atmospheric river that meteorologists were comparing to natural disasters from decades past. Winds would exceed 150 miles per hour at flight altitude, with temperature gradients that could ice over aircraft systems in minutes. Visibility would be near zero, and the electromagnetic activity would interfere with most navigation equipment. But Marina had flown in worse conditions. During her military career, she had specialized in impossible missions precisely because she thrived in situations where normal pilots failed. The key was understanding that aircraft were tools, and tools could accomplish anything if operated by someone with enough skill and determination. As dawn approached, Marina made her final preparations. She changed into her flight suit, the same one she had worn during her last official mission 12 years ago, carefully preserved and maintained even though she had never expected to wear it again. The material felt strange against her skin, after years of work clothes, but her body remembered the weight and movement of the specialized fabric. She walked to the hangar where her F-16 waited in the pre-dawn darkness. The aircraft looked exactly like what it was, a Predator designed for speed, precision, and survival in hostile environments. Marina ran through her pre-flight checks with automatic precision, her hands moving over controls and switches as if the 12-year gap had never existed. The engines spun up with a sound that brought back memories of dozens of combat missions, emergency scrambles, and flights that had seemed impossible until they became routine. Marina felt the familiar transformation occurring, the quiet mechanic falling away as the combat pilot emerged from deep hibernation. Elena Rodriguez was about to fly again, and somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, 157 people she had never met were depending on skills she had spent 12 years trying to forget. As she taxied toward the makeshift runway behind her garage, Marina caught sight of her reflection in the cockpit glass. The woman looking back wasn't Marina Castillo anymore. This was Phoenix, and she was going hunting in a storm that was about to test everything she had ever learned about flying, survival, and the weight of human life. The F-16 lifted off into the gray dawn sky, disappearing into the coastal fog, like a ghost returning to haunt the world she had left behind. Below, the town of Seaview continued its morning routine, unaware that their quiet mechanic was about to attempt one of the most dangerous rescue missions in aviation history. Marina checked her chronometer as she climbed toward her intercept. Altitude. Flight 447 would enter the storm system in exactly 43 minutes. She had that long to position herself, make contact with the commercial aircraft, and begin what would either be the most important mission of her career or the last flight she would ever make. The storm clouds ahead looked like a wall of darkness, stretching from the ocean surface to the edge of space. Lightning flickered in the depths of the system, and Marina's instruments were already detecting the electromagnetic interference that would blind the passenger jet's navigation systems. She keyed her radio to the emergency frequency and began broadcasting. Commercial Flight 447. This is an unidentified military aircraft. If you can hear this transmission, you are about to enter severe weather that will compromise your instruments. I am positioning to provide navigation assistance. Static answered her, but Marina knew the crew would hear her eventually. When their world dissolved into chaos and their instruments failed, her voice would be the only thing standing between 157 people and the storm that was waiting to claim them. Phoenix was back in the sky, and this time she was fighting to save lives instead of taking them. The storm hit Flight 447 exactly as the meteorologists had predicted, but no amount of scientific forecasting could have prepared Captain David Brennan for what awaited him at 32,000 feet above the Pacific. One moment he was reviewing approach vectors for Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, and the next moment every instrument on his Boeing 777 was either dead or displaying readings that defied physics. The turbulence struck like a physical assault, throwing the massive aircraft around like a toy in the hands of an angry child. Brennan fought the controls as his co-pilot, First Officer Lisa Park, struggled to make sense of the chaos erupting across their instrument panel. The autopilot had disengaged with a series of urgent chimes, leaving them flying manually through conditions that seemed designed to destroy aircraft. Navigation is completely dark, Park reported, her voice tight with controlled panic. GPS, inertial guidance, radio navigation, everything's offline. I'm getting magnetic compass readings that swing 40 degrees every few seconds. Brennan had 32 years of commercial aviation experience, including flights through severe weather that had made headlines, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this. The atmospheric river had created an electromagnetic storm that was wreaking havoc on every electronic system aboard the aircraft. Even backup instruments were providing contradictory information, making it impossible to determine their altitude, heading, or position relative to the ground. Behind them in the passenger cabin, 155 people were experiencing the worst turbulence most had ever encountered. Flight attendants struggled to remain upright as they moved through the aisles, checking on passengers and securing loose items that had become projectiles. Children cried while adults gripped armrests with white knuckles, their faces reflecting the terror that comes from being completely helpless 30,000 feet above the ocean. Margaret Foster, a retired teacher from Portland returning from visiting her grandchildren in Seattle, clutched her rosary and whispered prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood. In seat 23B, corporate executive James Chun tried to project calm for his nervous teenage daughter while internally calculating the odds of survival if the aircraft went down over open water. Near the back of the plane, Dr. Elena Vasquez, an Emergency room physician mentally inventoried the medical supplies that would be useless if they couldn't reach an airport. Each passenger had their own story, their own reasons for being aboard Flight 447, and their own people waiting for them. On the ground, none of them knew that their fate now rested in the hands of a woman who had spent 12 years hiding from the very skills that might save their lives. Marina's F-16 cut through the storm with a precision that would have been impossible for a larger aircraft. The fighter jet's design allowed it to slip between wind shears that would have torn a commercial airliner apart. But even with her exceptional skills, the conditions were testing every limit of both machine and pilot. Ice formed on her canopy, faster than the heating systems could clear it, forcing her to navigate using instrument references and brief glimpses through clear patches of glass. The electromagnetic interference was affecting her systems as well, though the military-grade electronics were more resilient than civilian equipment. Her radio crackled with static, but she could still transmit on emergency frequencies. Flight 447, this is Phoenix on guard frequency. If you can hear this transmission, key your microphone twice, Marina broadcast, using her old call sign instinctively. She repeated the message every 30 seconds while maneuvering to intercept the passenger jet's projected flight path. On the fourth repetition, she heard two distinct clicks through the static. Flight 447, I have contact. This is a military aircraft equipped for severe weather operations. I am positioning to provide navigation assistance. What is your current status? Captain Brennan's voice came through the interference like a lifeline. Military aircraft. This is Flight 447 Heavy. We have complete navigation failure and are flying blind in severe turbulence. 157 souls aboard. We need immediate assistance. Marina checked her position relative to the commercial aircraft. Her radar had acquired the 777's transponder signal intermittently, showing the larger plane struggling to maintain altitude and heading as it fought the storm. The passenger jet was being pushed off course by winds that exceeded anything in the weather briefings, driving it toward a mountain range that would be invisible until impact. Flight 447, you are currently heading 270 degrees and descending. You need to turn immediately to heading 340 degrees and climb to maintain terrain clearance. There are mountains at your 11 o'clock position. Military aircraft, our heading indicators are showing completely different readings. We have no reliable compass reference. Marina realized that the commercial pilots were flying with instruments that were actively lying to them. The electromagnetic interference was creating false readings that could lead them directly into controlled flight into terrain, the aviation term for crashing into mountains while believing you're flying over open water. She made a decision that would have violated every regulation in civilian aviation, but was exactly the kind of tactical thinking that had kept her alive through dozens of combat missions. Marina positioned her F-16 directly in front of the Boeing 777, close enough that Captain Brennan would be able to see her navigation lights through the storm. Flight 447, I am positioning as your lead aircraft. Follow my lights and maintain formation. I will navigate for both of us. The maneuver was incredibly dangerous. A fighter jet flying formation with a commercial airliner in severe weather violated fundamental principles of aviation safety. The wake turbulence from either aircraft could destabilize the other, and the speed differential between the two planes made collision a constant threat. But conventional safety rules were written for normal conditions, and nothing about their current situation was normal. Captain Brennan could see the military aircraft's lights through the chaos red and green navigation strobes that provided the only reliable reference points in a world gone mad. His instruments were telling him to turn east, but the fighter pilot was leading him northwest. He had to make a choice between trusting technology that was clearly compromised or following a stranger whose identity and qualifications were completely unknown. Military aircraft, identify yourself and your authority for this operation. Marina's response was immediate and carried the tone of someone accustomed to command. Flight 447, I am a military pilot with Category X weather certification conducting emergency assistance under aviation, Good Samaritan protocols. You can trust your instruments or you can trust me. Choose quickly, we have terrain ahead. The Category X certification was something Captain Brennan had heard mentioned in military aviation circles but never fully understood. It was supposedly reserved for pilots who could fly in conditions that grounded everyone else, but he had always assumed it was more legend than reality. Now faced with instruments that were actively dangerous and weather that exceeded his training, he found himself believing in legends. Military aircraft, Flight 447 is following your lead. What followed was one of the most challenging flying operations ever attempted. Marina guided the massive passenger jet through the storm, using a combination of her own navigation systems, dead reckoning, and instincts developed through years of flying in impossible conditions. She had to constantly adjust for the different flight characteristics of the two aircraft. Her F-16 could turn and climb much more aggressively than the Boeing 777, requiring her to lead by example while allowing the larger plane time to respond. The storm seemed determined to destroy both aircraft. Wind shear strong enough to flip a fighter jet tried to tear Marina's F-16 apart while she maintained position relative to the passenger plane. Ice accumulated on both aircraft faster than their systems could clear it, adding weight and changing aerodynamic characteristics in ways that threatened to send them into unrecoverable spins. Inside Flight 447, passengers experienced nearly 2 hours of the most terrifying flying conditions imaginable. The aircraft climbed and descended in response to Marina's navigation commands, following flight paths that seemed to defy logic, but somehow kept them away from the mountains that lurked invisibly in the storm. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, providing reassurance and maintaining order despite conditions that tested everyone's courage. Dr. Vasquez found herself treating several passengers for anxiety-related symptoms while privately marveling at the skill of whoever was flying their aircraft through conditions that should have been unsurvivable. Margaret Foster's prayers evolved from pleas for survival to expressions of gratitude for the unknown pilot who was leading them through the darkness. James Chun held his daughter's hand and told her stories about guardian angels who appeared when people needed them most. Marina's fuel was becoming a critical factor. The F-16 carried enough fuel for extended combat operations, but formation flying with a commercial airliner in severe weather consumed resources at a rate her mission planners had never anticipated. She calculated that she had enough fuel to guide Flight 447 to safety with approximately 15 minutes of reserve margin that would be comfortable in normal conditions, but was razor-thin given the uncertainty of the weather. The breakthrough came when her radio crackled with a transmission from Seattle. Center, military aircraft operating with Flight 447. This is Seattle Air Traffic Control. We have been monitoring your emergency frequency. Weather is beginning to clear to the west. Vector heading 285 degrees for approach to alternate airfield. Marina's navigation systems showed the weather pattern weakening along their new heading. She could see breaks in the cloud cover that revealed patches of ocean far below, confirming that they had successfully navigated around the mountain ranges that had threatened them earlier. Flight 447, we are beginning descent for approach. Your instruments should start coming back online as we clear the worst of the electromagnetic interference. Captain Brennan watched his cockpit displays flicker back to life as they descended below the most severe portions of the storm. GP, say. Navigation reappeared, followed by radio beacons and instrument landing systems that painted a picture of salvation ahead. They were approaching a military airfield on the Oregon coast, not their original destination. but a place where 157 people could return safely to the ground. Military aircraft, Flight 447 shows instruments coming back online. We have you on our traffic display and are ready to resume independent navigation. Marina checked her fuel gauge one final time. She had enough to see the passenger jet safely to the runway, but not enough to reach her own base. She would have to land at the same airfield and deal with the questions that would inevitably follow. Her 12 years of anonymity were about to end, but 157 people were going to live because of choices she had made in a storm that had tested everything she thought she knew about flying. The military airfield appeared through the clearing weather like an oasis of light in the darkness. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, their red and blue strobes creating a welcoming beacon for the aircraft that had fought their way through hell to reach safety. Marina guided Flight 447 through the instrument approach, watching as the massive passenger jet settled onto the runway, with the gentle touchdown of a pilot who had regained control of his aircraft and his destiny. Captain Brennan's voice came through the radio one final time as his aircraft rolled to a stop. Military Aircraft Phoenix, on behalf of Flight 447 and 157 souls aboard, thank you. We owe you our lives. Marina didn't respond immediately. She was circling the airfield, looking down at the passenger jet that had safely delivered its human cargo despite odds that should have been impossible to overcome. Fire trucks surrounded the Boeing 777, not because of emergency, but as a precautionary measure for an aircraft that had endured conditions beyond its design limits. She could see passengers disembarking, many of them kissing the ground or embracing family members who had driven through the storm to reach the alternate airfield. They would go home to their normal lives, probably never knowing the name of the pilot who had led them to safety. Some would tell stories about the mysterious military aircraft that had appeared in their darkest moment. Others would simply be grateful to be alive. Marina keyed her radio one final time. Flight 447, it was an honor to fly with you. Take care of your passengers. She brought her F-16 in for landing on the military runway, her fuel gauges showing numbers that confirmed she had pushed the mission to its absolute limits. As she taxied toward the parking area, she could see ground crews preparing to service her aircraft and military personnel gathering to debrief what would certainly be classified as one of the most unusual rescue operations in aviation history. Colonel Sarah Chun was waiting beside a military vehicle as Marina shut down her engines. Sarah looked exactly the same as she had 12 years ago, silver hair, sharp eyes, and the bearing of someone who had spent her career making impossible decisions. She watched as Marina climbed down from her fighter jet, noting that her former subordinate moved with the same confident precision that had once made her legendary among military pilots. "Hello, Elena," Sarah said quietly. "Hell of a flight." Marina pulled off her helmet, letting her black and silver hair fall around her shoulders. For the first time in 12 years, she was Elena Rodriguez again, standing on a military airfield after completing a mission that had saved lives instead of taking them. "Hello, Sarah. Nice to see you again." Behind them, passengers from Flight 447 were boarding buses that would take them to the terminal, where they could call family members and begin processing what they had survived. None of them looked toward the fighter jet that had led them through the storm, but Marina could feel their relief and gratitude like a physical presence. She had broken her 12-year exile from military aviation to save 157 strangers and, in doing so, had rediscovered something she thought she had lost forever. Elena Rodriguez was more than just a weapon. She was a guardian angel with wings and the skills to navigate through hell itself. The storm was finally clearing, revealing stars that had been hidden for hours. Marina looked up at the sky that had once been her domain and realized that some things were worth coming out of hiding for. Some missions were worth the risk of exposure. 157 people were alive because she had remembered how to be more than just a mechanic hiding in a small town. She had remembered how to be Phoenix, and Phoenix protected the innocent, no matter what the cost. The debriefing room at Kingsley Field felt like stepping back in time for Marina, with its sterile fluorescent lighting and government-issued furniture that hadn't changed since her active duty days. She sat across from Colonel Sarah Chun and a panel of officials whose credentials suggested this incident had attracted attention from the highest levels of military and civilian aviation authorities. The weight of their collective stare reminded her why she had chosen anonymity over recognition 12 years ago. "Let's start with the basics," said General Patricia Hayes, a woman whose silver eagles indicated recent promotion to the upper echelons of Air Force Command. "You've been operating a military-grade fighter aircraft without authorization, maintaining flight proficiency without oversight, and conducting unauthorized operations in civilian airspace. Any one of these activities could result in federal prosecution." Marina met the general's gaze with the steady calm she had perfected during years of high-stakes missions. "I saved 157 lives today, General. If that's a crime, I'll accept the consequences." The civilian representative from the Federal Aviation Administration leaned forward, consulting his tablet with the intensity of someone building a case. "Ms. Rodriguez, your aircraft isn't registered with any civilian authority. It carries no tail number, no airworthiness certificate, and no insurance coverage. You've been maintaining what amounts to a ghost aircraft for over a decade." "The aircraft was legally salvaged through military surplus channels," Marina replied. "I have documentation proving legitimate acquisition and ownership transfer." Colonel Chun placed a folder on the table between them. "We've reviewed your paperwork, Elena. Everything appears to be in order, technically speaking. But technical legality doesn't explain why one of the most decorated pilots in Air Force history chose to disappear completely from official records." The room fell silent as Marina considered how much truth she was willing to reveal. The real story of her disappearance involved classified operations, government betrayals, and decisions made by people whose names appeared on no organizational charts. She had vanished not because she was running from the law, but because she was running from the people who wrote the laws. "I had my reasons," she said finally. "Personal reasons that don't affect national security or public safety." General Hayes opened a different file, one that made Marina's stomach tighten with recognition. "Operation Desert Phoenix. Your last official mission. You were leading a formation of 6 aircraft on a combat air patrol when you encountered enemy fighters. Official reports state that you single-handedly engaged 8 enemy aircraft, destroying 6 and driving off the remaining 2. Your wingman's aircraft was damaged, and you provided escort until both planes reached friendly airspace." Marina remembered that mission with crystal clarity. The heat of the desert, the weight of responsibility for keeping her squadron alive, and the split-second decisions that meant the difference between heroes' funerals and pilots returning to their families. What the official reports didn't mention was what had happened after they landed. "The mission was successful," Marina said. Carefully, "all American aircraft and personnel returned safely." "Yes, they did," the general continued. "But what happened during your debrief raised questions that apparently were never satisfactorily answered. You reported that the enemy fighters were using tactics and equipment that suggested advanced training and possibly foreign assistance. When pressed for details, you became increasingly unwilling to elaborate." The FAA representative looked up from his tablet with newfound interest. "Were you ordered to falsify your after-action report?" Marina felt the familiar weight of old secrets pressing down on her. The truth was that her superiors had wanted her to report that the enemy pilots were poorly trained and equipped, fitting the narrative that justified ongoing operations in the region. When she refused to lie about what she had observed, certain powerful people had begun questioning her reliability and patriotism, I reported what I saw, she said. Some people didn't like the implications of my observations. Colonel Chun leaned back in her chair, studying Marina with the expression of someone solving a complex puzzle. You were offered early retirement with full benefits 6 months after that mission. According to your personnel file, you declined, and instead requested transfer to a training command position. When that request was denied, you submitted your resignation and disappeared. I decided I was more valuable as a civilian than as a military asset whose integrity was being questioned. The room fell quiet again as the implications of Marina's statement settled over the assembled officials. The suggestion that military leadership had pressured her to alter mission reports touched on scandals that had ended careers and toppled administrations. Everyone present understood that they were discussing matters that could have far-reaching consequences beyond this single meeting. General Hayes closed the file and fixed Marina with a direct stare. Ms. Rodriguez, your actions today saved 157 civilian lives. Captain Brennan has submitted a formal report crediting you with exceptional airmanship under impossible conditions. The passengers aboard Flight 447 are calling you a hero, and several news organizations are requesting interviews about the mysterious military pilot who appeared during the storm. Marina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Media attention was the last thing she needed if she hoped to return to her quiet life in Seaview. I'm not interested in publicity, General. I did what any qualified pilot would have done in similar circumstances. That's where you're wrong, said Dr. Michael Torres, a civilian flight instructor who had been silent until now. We've analyzed the weather conditions you flew through today. Wind speeds exceeded 160 miles per hour at flight altitude. Electromagnetic interference was strong enough to disable military-grade navigation equipment. Visibility was effectively zero for over an hour. No other pilot we know of would have attempted what you accomplished, let alone succeeded. The FAA representative pulled up meteorological data on his tablet, showing red and orange zones that indicated weather conditions beyond anything in civilian flying regulations. Ms. Rodriguez, you guided a commercial airliner through a Category 5 atmospheric river while flying formation in a single-seat fighter aircraft. The mathematical probability of success for such an operation approaches zero. Marina studied the weather maps, remembering the reality behind the sanitized data. The numbers couldn't capture the sensation of ice forming faster than heating systems could clear it, or the physical strain of fighting control surfaces that felt like they were connected to some vast malevolent force determined to tear her aircraft apart. Experience helps, she said simply. I've flown in severe weather before. Colonel Chun smiled for the first time since the meeting began. Elena, you've flown in conditions that most pilots couldn't imagine surviving. Your military record shows 17 weather-related rescues, 23 combat air patrols in severe weather, and 6 emergency recoveries that other pilots had declared impossible. You didn't just have experience today. You had expertise that exists nowhere else in the world. The weight of their collective attention was becoming uncomfortable. Marina had spent 12 years avoiding exactly this kind of scrutiny, building a life where her past achievements were safely buried under the mundane routine of fixing civilian engines. The woman who had guided Flight 447 through the storm was supposed to be dead, replaced by a small-town mechanic who wanted nothing more than anonymity and peace. What happens now? Marina asked, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. General Hayes exchanged glances with Colonel Chun before responding. That depends on several factors. Your actions today have attracted attention from multiple agencies and organizations. The Air Force is interested in discussing your return to active duty. The FAA wants to understand how you maintained such high proficiency without official oversight. And there are certain civilian contractors who provide aviation services to government Agencies, contractors who could use someone with your unique qualifications. Marina felt the familiar sensation of being hunted, the same feeling that had driven her into hiding 12 years ago. Different people were making the offers now, but the underlying message was the same. Exceptional skills came with obligations that couldn't be ignored indefinitely. "I'm not interested in returning to military service," she said firmly. "I've built a life as a civilian, and I intend to keep it that way, even if that life is now impossible to maintain." The FAA representative asked, "Ms. Rodriguez, your actions today have been documented by air traffic control, recorded by multiple agencies, and witnessed by 157 passengers who are eager to thank their rescuer. The story is already spreading through aviation circles and social media. Your anonymity ended the moment you keyed your radio and identified yourself as Phoenix." The truth of his statement hit Marina like a physical blow. She had known that conducting the rescue would expose her identity, but she had hoped the incident could be contained through official channels. The idea that passengers were sharing their story publicly meant that her carefully constructed cover was already crumbling. Dr. Torres consulted his own notes before addressing Marina directly. "There's another consideration. What you accomplished today represents a significant advancement in severe weather aviation techniques. The military and civilian aviation communities could benefit enormously from understanding your methods and training protocols. You have knowledge that could save thousands of lives in future weather emergencies." Marina felt the walls closing in around her as each official presented compelling reasons why Elena Rodriguez needed to emerge from hiding. They weren't threatening her with prosecution or forcing her return to military service, but they were making it clear that Marina Castillo's quiet existence was no longer viable. "I need time to consider my options," she said finally. General Hayes nodded. "We understand this is a significant decision. But Ms. Rodriguez, time is not unlimited. The story of today's rescue is spreading, and other interested parties are already making inquiries about the pilot who saved Flight 447. It would be better for everyone if you made your intentions clear sooner rather than later." The meeting concluded with handshakes and business cards, but Marina felt like she was drowning in obligations she had never sought. As the officials filed out of the debriefing room, Colonel Chun remained behind, her expression mixing professional concern with personal worry. "Elena, I know this isn't what you wanted," Sarah said quietly. "When I sent you those coordinates this morning, I was thinking about saving 157 lives. I wasn't considering the cost to you personally." Marina looked through the window at her F-16, which ground crews were refueling and inspecting with the thoroughness reserved for aircraft that had just completed impossible missions. "Those people deserve to live, Sarah. I don't regret the choice I made. But you regret the consequences. I regret that doing the right thing always seems to come with a price I didn't agree to pay." Sarah leaned against the window, studying Marina's profile with the intensity of someone trying to solve an equation with too many variables. There might be a third option. Something between disappearing again and returning to full military service. Marina turned to face her former commanding officer, recognizing the tone that had once preceded some of the most creative mission planning she had ever encountered. "What kind of option?" "Freelance aviation consulting. Civilian contractor status with military liaison privileges. You would maintain your independence while providing expertise for situations that require your specific skills. No permanent assignment, no chain of command, no obligation to accept missions that compromise your principles." The proposal was intriguing in its simplicity. Marina could potentially maintain some version of her civilian life, while occasionally using her skills for situations like today's rescue. But she had learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too reasonable, especially from people who understood the value of exceptional capabilities. "Who would I be working for?" Multiple agencies, depending on the situation. Sometimes the Air Force for weather-related emergencies. Sometimes civilian authorities for search and rescue operations. Sometimes international organizations for humanitarian missions. The common thread would be situations where conventional approaches have failed and unconventional expertise is required. Marina considered the implications while watching ground crews complete their inspection of her aircraft. The F-16 looked exactly as it had 12 years ago, lethal, precise, and ready for whatever mission came next. The difference was that today it had been used to save lives rather than take them, and that distinction felt more significant than she had expected. What about oversight? Accountability? The bureaucracy that made military service impossible. For me? Sarah smiled with the expression of someone who had anticipated the question. Minimal oversight, direct accountability to mission commanders, and bureaucracy limited to mission-specific requirements. You would essentially be operating as an independent consultant who happens to own military-grade equipment and possess unique qualifications. The offer was more attractive than Marina wanted to admit. It would allow her to use her skills for meaningful purposes while maintaining the autonomy she had fought to preserve. But it would also mean acknowledging that Elena Rodriguez could never fully disappear, that the world had legitimate claims on abilities that existed nowhere else. "I need to think about it," Marina said. "And I need to return to Oregon and figure out what's left of my life there." "Of course, but Elena, don't take too long to decide. The world has a way of making decisions for people who wait too long to choose their own path." Marina left the debriefing facility as the sun was setting over the Oregon coast, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her why she had chosen this part of the world for her exile. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind air so clear that she could see individual peaks in the Cascade Range from 50 miles away. Her F-16 had been refueled and cleared for departure, but Marina found herself reluctant to leave the military environment that had once been her natural habitat. For 12 years, she had convinced herself that she was happier as a civilian, that the responsibilities and pressures of military aviation were behind her forever. Today had reminded her that some aspects of her old life had been sources of deep satisfaction rather than just stress. The flight back to Seaview took 30 minutes, but Marina spent the time processing 12 years of carefully buried emotions. She had become a fighter pilot because she wanted to serve something larger than herself, to use exceptional abilities for meaningful purposes. When that service had been compromised by politics and bureaucracy, she had chosen exile rather than corruption. But today's mission had been pure no politics, no hidden agendas, just the simple equation of using her skills to save innocent lives. The passengers aboard Flight 447 hadn't cared about her military record or her reasons for disappearing. They had simply needed someone capable of leading them through a storm that would have killed them all. As Marina approached her hidden hangar, she could see lights in her garage that shouldn't have been there. Multiple vehicles were parked in the normally empty lot, and people were moving around with the purposeful activity of a major investigation. Her 12 years of anonymity had officially ended, and whatever happened next would require decisions she had hoped never to make. She landed her F-16 in the darkness behind her property, using night vision equipment to navigate without external lights. The aircraft rolled to a stop inside the hangar where it had waited for over a decade, but Marina knew this would likely be its last night of hiding. Walking toward her garage, she could see the scope of the attention her actions had generated. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes aimed skyward like technological prayers. FBI vehicles sat beside local police cars, suggesting that multiple agencies were coordinating their response to the day's events. Most concerning were the unmarked sedans with government plates that indicated interests beyond simple law enforcement. Marina paused at the edge of her property, studying the scene with tactical awareness that had been dormant but never truly absent. She counted personnel, noted escape routes, and assessed threat levels with automatic precision. Whatever was waiting for her in that garage, it represented the end of Marina Castillo's quiet existence. The bell above the garage door chimed as Marina entered her shop for what might be the last time as its anonymous owner. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez of the FBI looked up from examining Marina's perfectly organized tool collection, her expression mixing professional interest with personal curiosity. "Ms. Rodriguez, I'm Agent Martinez. We've been waiting for you." Marina surveyed her invaded sanctuary, noting that the investigators had been respectful of her property while conducting what was obviously a thorough search. Nothing appeared damaged or moved unnecessarily, suggesting that these were professionals rather than bureaucrats looking to make a point. "Am I under arrest?" "No, ma'am. You're not suspected of any crimes. But your actions today have raised questions that multiple agencies need to address. We're hoping you'll cooperate with our investigation." Marina looked around at the garage that had been her refuge for 12 years, seeing it now through the eyes of investigators who were trying to understand how a small-town mechanic had pulled off one of the most remarkable rescues in aviation history. Her tools, her work, her carefully constructed life, all of it was being examined for clues about the woman behind Marina Castillo. What kind of questions? Agent Martinez gestured toward a table where several officials were reviewing documents that Marina recognized as her business records, tax returns, and maintenance logs. "How did you maintain such advanced flying skills without official oversight? Where did you acquire the resources to keep a military aircraft in perfect condition? And most importantly, are there other individuals operating similar capabilities without government knowledge?" The last question revealed the real concern driving the investigation. Marina's rescue of Flight 447 had demonstrated that exceptional military capabilities could exist outside official channels. In a world where national security depended on controlling access to advanced weapons and training, the idea of freelance fighter pilots was deeply troubling to people whose job was maintaining institutional monopolies on force. "I maintained my skills through regular practice and continued study," Marina said carefully. "The aircraft was legally acquired and properly maintained. And as far as I know, I'm the only person operating this way." "Ms. Rodriguez, your maintenance logs show that you've been flying an average of 40 hours per month for the past 12 years. That's more flight time than most active duty pilots accumulate. Where were you flying, and why wasn't this activity detected by air traffic control or military radar?" Marina had anticipated this question and prepared an answer that was technically truthful if incomplete. "I conducted training flights over remote areas at low altitude, often during weather conditions that limited radar coverage. I avoided controlled airspace and maintained radio silence to prevent interference with civilian and military operations." Agent Martinez consulted her notes with the expression of someone who suspected there was more to the story. "Ms. Rodriguez, we've analyzed radar data from the past 12 years. There are occasional returns that might correspond to your aircraft, but the pattern suggests extremely sophisticated knowledge of radar coverage and air defense procedures. This level of operational security typically requires intelligence support." The implication was clear. They suspected Marina was working for someone else, possibly a foreign intelligence service or domestic organization with anti-government intentions. The idea that she might simply be a skilled individual operating independently was apparently too simple for investigators trained to look for complex conspiracies. "I planned my routes carefully to avoid detection," Marina replied. 12 years of flying the same general area teaches you where the gaps are in surveillance coverage." A new voice joined the conversation as Colonel Chun entered the garage, her presence immediately shifting the dynamic from interrogation to coordination. "Agent Martinez, I think we can stipulate that Ms. Rodriguez has been operating independently. The question now is what happens going forward." Marina felt a surge of gratitude for Sarah's intervention, though she suspected it came with obligations that hadn't been fully explained. The colonel's timing was too convenient to be coincidental, suggesting that military and civilian authorities had been coordinating their approach to the Elena Rodriguez problem. Colonel Chun, we appreciate the military's interest in this case. Agent Martinez said with professional courtesy that didn't quite hide territorial concerns. But Ms. Rodriguez is a civilian operating in civilian airspace. The FBI has jurisdiction over her activities. Agent Martinez, Ms. Rodriguez conducted a rescue operation that saved 157 American lives using capabilities that currently exist nowhere else in our national defense structure. While she may technically be a civilian, her actions have implications that extend well beyond civilian law enforcement. Marina watched the jurisdictional maneuvering with the detached interest of someone whose fate was being decided by people who had never asked her opinion. Federal agencies were essentially negotiating over who would get to control her future, treating her exceptional abilities as a national resource that couldn't be allowed to operate outside official oversight. Perhaps we should ask Ms. Rodriguez what she wants, suggested Dr. Michael Torres, who had followed Colonel Chun into the garage. After all, she's the one who saved all those lives today. The room fell silent as all attention focused on Marina. She looked around at the assembled officials, recognizing that her answer would determine not just her own future but possibly the precedent for how exceptional individuals were treated by government institutions. I want to continue living as a civilian, she said firmly. I want to maintain my privacy and my independence. And I want to be left alone to make my own choices about when and how to use my abilities. Agent Martinez frowned, clearly unsatisfied with an answer that didn't provide the control her agency needed. Ms. Rodriguez, your capabilities represent a significant national security asset. The government has legitimate interests in ensuring those capabilities are used appropriately and not compromised by foreign or domestic threats. Marina felt the familiar anger rising, the same frustration that had driven her into exile 12 years ago. Agent Martinez, I'm not a weapon to be controlled or a resource to be managed. I'm an American citizen who happens to have unusual skills. Today I use those skills to save innocent lives. If that's a threat to national security, then we have a fundamental disagreement about what this country stands for. Colonel Chun stepped forward, recognizing the signs of an escalating confrontation that would benefit no one. Elena, no one here is trying to control you or treat you as government property. But your actions today have attracted attention from people who may not have America's best interests at heart. We need to ensure your security while protecting the capabilities you've demonstrated. Marina understood the subtext. Foreign intelligence services would be very interested in recruiting someone with her skills and knowledge. Terrorist organizations would see her as either a valuable asset or a threat to be eliminated. Criminal enterprises might try to force her cooperation through threats against innocent people. Her anonymity had been her protection, and that protection was now gone. What are you proposing? Sarah produced a document from her briefcase, handing it to Marina with the expression of someone presenting a solution to a complex problem. Civilian contractor status with the Department of Defense. You would maintain your independence and civilian identity while providing consultation services for specific situations. No permanent assignment, no military chain of command, but access to official protection and resources when needed. Marina scanned the document, noting clauses that provided significant autonomy while ensuring government oversight of her activities. It was essentially the arrangement Sarah had described during their earlier conversation, formalized in language that would satisfy bureaucratic requirements while preserving her essential freedoms. And if I refuse? Agent Martinez answered, with the bluntness of someone stating unavoidable facts. Ms. Rodriguez, you can't disappear again. Your story is already spreading through social media and news organizations. People know that Elena Rodriguez saved Flight 447, and they're going to want to find you. You can work with us to manage that attention, or you can face it alone." Marina looked around her garage one final time, seeing 12 years of careful construction about to be dismantled by forces beyond her control. The choice wasn't really whether to remain hidden or return to public service. The choice was between controlled exposure and chaotic revelation, between official protection and complete vulnerability. She thought about the passengers aboard Flight 447, people who were alive because she had chosen to act rather than hide. She thought about the other emergencies that might require her unique capabilities, situations where conventional approaches would fail and innocent people would die without intervention. Most importantly, she thought about the satisfaction she had felt during today's mission, the sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for 12 years. "I'll accept the contractor position," Marina said finally. "But I have conditions." Colonel Chun smiled with the expression of someone whose careful planning had achieved its intended result. "What conditions? I choose which missions to accept. I maintain my civilian residence and business. And if the arrangement becomes unacceptable for any reason, I can terminate it without penalty or harassment." "Agreed," Sarah said immediately. Before anyone else could object, Agent Martinez looked less satisfied but nodded her acceptance. "The FBI will want periodic briefings on your activities and advance notice of any international travel or contact with foreign nationals, within reasonable limits," Marina replied. "I'm not going to become a prisoner of my own abilities." Dr. Torres stepped forward with the enthusiasm of someone who had just gained access to invaluable expertise. "Ms. Rodriguez, there are dozens of aviation challenges that could benefit from your knowledge. Weather-related emergencies, search and rescue operations, experimental aircraft testing. Your skills could save thousands of lives over the coming years." Marina felt the weight of new responsibilities settling on her shoulders, but for the first time in 12 years, they felt like choices rather than obligations. She would be Elena Rodriguez again, but on her own terms and for purposes she believed in. As the various officials completed their paperwork and prepared to leave, Marina walked to the window overlooking the hangar where her F-16 waited in darkness. Tomorrow, news crews would photograph the aircraft that had saved Flight 447. Reporters would tell the story of the mysterious mechanic, who turned out to be one of the world's most skilled pilots. And Elena Rodriguez would begin a new chapter in a life that had already included more adventure than most people could imagine. The passengers of Flight 447 would return to their families with stories about guardian angels and impossible rescues. Captain Brennan would file reports about the mysterious military pilot who had appeared during their darkest hour. And somewhere in the Pentagon, planners would begin incorporating Elena Rodriguez's capabilities into contingency plans for emergencies that hadn't happened yet. Marina Castillo had been a comfortable fiction, a role that had provided safety and anonymity for 12 years. But Elena Rodriguez was the truth, and truth had a way of demanding recognition regardless of how carefully it was hidden. As the last official vehicle pulled away from her garage, Marina stood alone in the space that had been her sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring reporters, admirers, and probably a few people who thought she was a fraud or a threat. But tonight, she could simply be proud of having used her abilities to save 157 innocent lives. In the distance, she could hear the sound of aircraft engines, probably news helicopters positioning for tomorrow's coverage. The irony wasn't lost on her that the woman who had spent 12 years hiding from aviation was about to become one of its most famous figures. Elena Rodriguez was back, and the world would never be quite the same. 3 months after the Flight 447 rescue, Elena Rodriguez stood in the briefing room of a military installation she couldn't name, studying satellite imagery of a humanitarian crisis unfolding on the other side of the world. The photographs showed a remote valley in the Hindu Kush Mountains, where an earthquake had trapped 63 aid workers in a makeshift clinic, their only escape route blocked by avalanches that made conventional rescue impossible. The briefing officer, a young Air Force captain whose name she hadn't bothered to learn, pointed to topographical maps that told the story of an impossible mission. The valley is at 14,000 feet elevation, surrounded by peaks that exceed 20,000 feet. Weather conditions include sustained winds of 80 miles per hour, temperature dropping to -30 degrees Fahrenheit, and cloud cover that extends from 8,000 feet to the ceiling. Elena studied the terrain with the analytical mind of someone who had spent her career solving problems that other pilots considered unsolvable. The valley was essentially a box canyon with vertical walls on 3 sides and an entrance so narrow that most aircraft couldn't navigate the approach even in perfect conditions. Add severe weather, and the mission became something that existed beyond the edge of standard operational parameters. "What's the timeline?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer would be measured in hours rather than days. "The clinic structure is failing," replied Dr. Sarah Kim, a civilian contractor who specialized in disaster response coordination. "Our engineers estimate complete structural collapse within 18 hours. The aid workers have limited food, no heat, and several injured personnel who need immediate medical evacuation." Elena turned her attention to the aircraft specifications, displayed on wall-mounted screens. The military had provided her with access to their most advanced rescue helicopters, aircraft equipped with weather-resistant navigation systems and high-altitude performance capabilities that represented the cutting edge of rotorcraft technology. Under normal circumstances, any of these machines would be capable of conducting the evacuation. But these weren't normal circumstances. The combination of altitude, weather, and terrain created a challenge that pushed beyond the operational limits of conventional aircraft and crews. Even the most experienced military pilots had declined the mission after reviewing the conditions, determining that the risk of additional casualties outweighed the potential for successful rescue. "Why, Emmy?" Elena asked, though she was beginning to understand that her reputation for impossible missions had spread through military and civilian emergency response networks faster than she had anticipated. Colonel Chun, who had become Elena's primary liaison with government agencies, pulled up performance data from Elena's aircraft. "Your F-16 has been modified with systems that give it capabilities no other aircraft possesses. More importantly, you have experience conducting operations in terrain and weather conditions that would ground any other pilot," Elena considered. The modifications she had made to her fighter jet over 12 years of careful engineering. The aircraft's engines had been upgraded with components that allowed operation at altitudes beyond standard specifications. Her navigation systems included experimental technology that could function despite electromagnetic interference that disabled conventional equipment. Most significantly, she had installed life support systems that could sustain operations in environments that would kill unprotected humans. "The F-16 isn't designed for passenger transport," Elena pointed out. "Even with modifications, I can only carry 1 person per trip. 63 evacuees would require 63 separate flights under impossible conditions." Dr. Kim consulted her tablet before responding with the grim calculation that defined emergency rescue operations. "We've identified 12 personnel with life-threatening injuries who require immediate evacuation. The remaining 51 individuals can survive longer if we can get them medical supplies and heating equipment. Your mission would be to evacuate the critical cases first, then deliver supplies to sustain the others until weather conditions improve enough for conventional rescue operations." Elena studied the mission parameters while calculating fuel requirements, flight times, and the physical demands of conducting multiple high-altitude rescues in severe weather. Each flight would push her aircraft and her own endurance to their absolute limits. Landing in the confined space of the valley would require precision that allowed no margin for error. And all of this would need to be accomplished while fighting weather conditions that had already defeated every other rescue attempt. What kind of support would I have? Captain Morrison consulted his operational notes before outlining resources that represented a significant commitment from multiple agencies. Weather monitoring from National Weather Service high-altitude stations, satellite communication support from Space Command, and emergency medical teams standing by at 3 different staging areas. We've also positioned fuel and maintenance support at forward bases that would allow you to minimize transit time between missions. Elena appreciated the thoroughness of the planning, but she also understood that all the support in the world couldn't change the fundamental reality of the mission. She would be flying alone into conditions that had never been successfully navigated, attempting rescues that required split-second timing and perfect execution repeated 12 times without a single mistake. I need to see the aircraft and review the medical personnel files, she said finally. If I'm going to risk my life 12 times, I want to understand exactly who I'm trying to save. The hangar where her F-16 waited had been transformed into a high-tech operations center that rivaled anything she had seen during her military career. Ground crews were installing additional life support equipment while technicians calibrated navigation systems for the specific challenges of high-altitude mountain flying. Elena ran her hands along the aircraft's fuselage, checking modifications that would allow it to function as an improvised ambulance for people whose lives depended on her ability to transport them safely through impossible conditions. Dr. Kim provided detailed medical files for each of the 12 critical patients, their conditions ranging from crush injuries sustained during the earthquake to hypothermia that was steadily worsening in the unheated clinic. Elena studied each case with the methodical attention of someone who understood that successful rescue required knowing not just where to find people, but how to keep them alive during transport. This patient has internal bleeding that makes high-G maneuvers potentially fatal, Elena noted, pointing to the file of Dr. James Patterson, a surgeon who had been operating when the earthquake struck. And this woman has spinal injuries that could be worsened by the vibration and acceleration of fighter aircraft flight. Dr. Kim nodded grimly. We've consulted with trauma specialists about transport protocols. Each patient will need to be stabilized with medical equipment before flight, and you'll need to maintain specific flight parameters to avoid exacerbating their injuries. It's not just a rescue mission, it's 12 separate medical transport operations under combat conditions. Elena felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the knowledge that innocent people would live or die based on decisions she made in the cockpit of an aircraft never designed for humanitarian missions. But she also felt the satisfaction that came from being uniquely qualified to attempt something that no one else could accomplish. When do we launch? Colonel Chun checked her watch before providing the timeline that would govern the next 18 hours of Elena's life. Weather window opens in 4 hours. You'll have approximately 14 hours of flyable conditions before the next storm system arrives. After that, the valley will be completely inaccessible for at least a week. Elena spent the next 3 hours reviewing flight plans, studying terrain models, and conducting final equipment checks with the thoroughness of someone who understood that survival depended on preparation. Her F-16 had been modified with additional fuel tanks that extended its range, but also changed its flight characteristics in ways that required careful calculation. The rescue equipment added weight and bulk that affected aerodynamic performance, making an already challenging mission even more demanding. As she prepared for takeoff, Elena received a transmission on her secure radio frequency. Phoenix, this is Flight 447 actual. We heard about your mission and wanted to wish you luck. Captain Brennan's voice brought back memories of the storm that had changed her life 3 months ago. The commercial pilot who had trusted her to guide his aircraft through impossible weather was now following news reports about her humanitarian missions, apparently feeling a personal connection to someone who had saved his passengers' lives. Flight 447, appreciate the support. Take care of yourselves up there. Phoenix, 157 people are alive because of what you did for us. Now you're going to save 63 more. The world is lucky to have you. Elena felt a surge of emotion that reminded her why she had chosen to emerge from hiding. The passengers aboard Flight 447 represented more than just a successful mission. They were proof that exceptional abilities could be used to create hope rather than destruction, to build rather than tear down. The flight to the Hindu Kush took 8 hours, including 2 refueling stops at military bases that existed on no public maps. Elena's route took her across 3 continents and through airspace controlled by allies who had been briefed on her humanitarian mission. Each leg of the journey brought her closer to mountains that had defeated every previous rescue attempt. Terrain so severe that even experienced mountaineers avoided the region during winter months. As she approached the target area, Elena's instruments detected the weather conditions that had made conventional rescue impossible. Wind speeds exceeded 100 miles per hour at flight altitude, with downdrafts that could slam an aircraft into mountainsides before pilots could react. Temperature readings showed atmospheric conditions that would ice over most aircraft systems within minutes of exposure. But Elena's F-16 had been designed to operate in hostile environments, and her modifications had extended those capabilities into realms that military engineers considered theoretical. She descended through cloud layers that obscured the mountains until she was flying by instrument reference alone, navigating through valleys and passes that appeared on her displays as narrow corridors between towering walls of rock and ice. The clinic appeared through the clouds like a small island of civilization in an ocean of wilderness. Elena could see the damaged structure that housed 63 people, whose only hope of survival depended on her ability to land an F-16 in a space barely large enough for a helicopter. The valley floor was covered with debris from avalanches, creating obstacles that would challenge even ground vehicles. Elena keyed her radio to the emergency frequency the aid workers were monitoring. Clinic personnel, this is Phoenix inbound for evacuation. Prepare your most critical patient for immediate transport. The response came from Dr. Martinez, the clinic's senior physician who had been coordinating survival efforts since the earthquake. Phoenix, we have 12 critical patients ready for transport. Landing area has been cleared and marked with signal flares. Be advised that wind conditions are variable and dangerous. Elena could see the flares marking the improvised landing zone, a stretch of relatively flat ground that was approximately twice the length her aircraft needed for landing and takeoff. The approach would require precision that allowed no margin for error, threading between avalanche debris and damaged structures while fighting winds that could flip her aircraft. If she misjudged their direction or intensity, she lined up for her approach with the calm focus that had characterized her most dangerous missions. The F-16 descended through turbulence that would have torn apart a less robust aircraft, its modified systems responding to her control inputs with precision that bordered on telepathic. At the last second, a crosswind gust tried to push her aircraft toward the damaged clinic building, but Elena compensated with control movements so subtle they were almost instinctive. The fighter jet touched down on the valley floor with the gentle precision of a surgeon's scalpel, rolling to a stop just meters from the medical team that was waiting with their first patient. Elena shut down her engines and climbed out of the cockpit to find herself surrounded by people whose faces showed the strain of surviving in impossible conditions while caring for others who depended on their expertise. Dr. Martinez was a small woman whose calm demeanor suggested someone accustomed to working under pressure. But Elena could see the relief in her eyes as she watched the rescue aircraft that no one had believed would actually arrive. Dr. Rodriguez, we weren't sure anyone could make it through the weather. Your arrival may have just saved all our lives. Elena helped the medical team load Dr. Patterson into the aircraft's modified passenger compartment, ensuring that his injuries were properly supported for what would be a challenging flight to the nearest trauma center. The surgeon was unconscious from pain medication, but his vital signs suggested that rapid transport could save his life if Elena could deliver him safely through conditions that had defeated every other rescue attempt. The takeoff required even more precision than the landing, with Elena using every inch of available runway while calculating weight and balance factors that would affect her aircraft's performance during the flight to safety. The F-16 lifted off just as another avalanche thundered down the mountainside. Missing the clinic by mere hundreds of meters, Dr. Patterson survived the flight to the military hospital in Pakistan, where trauma surgeons were able to stabilize his condition and arrange for transport to a facility equipped for his long-term care. Elena refueled her aircraft and immediately returned to the valley, where 11 more people were waiting for rescue missions that would test her skills and endurance to their absolute limits. Each subsequent flight brought its own challenges. The weather continued to deteriorate, with cloud cover dropping and wind speeds increasing in ways that made the valley increasingly difficult to access. Elena found herself flying by memory and instinct, using landmarks that were barely visible through the storm to navigate approaches that required split-second timing and perfect execution. The third patient was Maria Santos, a nurse whose hypothermia had progressed to life-threatening levels despite the medical team's efforts to keep her warm. Elena wrapped the woman in heating blankets and monitored her vital signs during a flight that seemed to take forever, watching instruments that showed they were fighting weather conditions beyond anything she had previously experienced. By the 7th evacuation, Elena was operating on determination and caffeine, her body exhausted from the physical demands of flying in severe turbulence, while maintaining the precision necessary to land in the confined space of the valley. Her aircraft was performing flawlessly, but she could feel the accumulated stress of repeated high-altitude operations in mountains that seemed determined to claim both aircraft and pilot. The 10th patient presented a challenge that pushed Elena's modified F-16 to its absolute limits. Dr. Robert Kim weighed over 200 pounds and required life support equipment that added significant weight to an aircraft already operating at the edge of its performance envelope. Elena had to calculate fuel consumption, takeoff performance, and flight characteristics with mathematical precision that allowed no margin for error. The takeoff was the most demanding of the entire mission, with Elena using every technique she had learned during decades of flying to coax her overloaded aircraft into the air. The F-16 climbed slowly through turbulence that tried to slam it back into the mountainside, engines straining to provide thrust in the thin air of high altitude while carrying weight that threatened to exceed design limits. But Dr. Kim survived the flight, as did the 11th patient and finally the 12th. Elena's last evacuation was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a pediatric specialist who had remained conscious throughout her injuries and insisted on thanking Elena personally for risking her life to save people she had never met. Dr. Rodriguez, what you've done today will never be forgotten, Dr. Walsh said as Elena helped her into the aircraft. 12 people are alive because you were willing to fly into conditions that no one else would attempt. Elena secured the woman's restraints while checking instruments that showed weather conditions continuing to deteriorate. This would be her last flight before the valley became completely inaccessible, and she could feel the satisfaction that came from completing a mission that had seemed impossible when she first reviewed the operational parameters. Dr. Walsh, you and your colleagues were doing important work in a place where help was desperately needed. Getting you out safely was the least I could do. The final flight to safety was Elena's most challenging, with weather conditions that pushed her aircraft and her own skills to their absolute limits. Wind shears strong enough to tear apart conventional aircraft tried to slam her F-16 into mountainsides that appeared and disappeared in cloud cover that reduced visibility to mere meters. But Elena navigated through the storm with the expertise that had made her legendary among military pilots, using instruments and instincts to thread her aircraft through conditions that existed beyond the edge of human endurance. When she finally emerged from the mountains into clear air, she could see the lights of the Pakistani military base where medical teams were waiting to receive their last patient from the impossible rescue mission. Dr. Walsh was stable when Elena delivered her to the trauma center, bringing the total number of successful evacuations to 12 out of 12 attempted. No lives had been lost during the rescue operations, and weather reports confirmed that Elena had extracted the critical patients just hours before conditions became unsurvivable, even for people on the ground. The remaining 51 aid workers were resupplied with heating equipment and medical supplies that would sustain them until conventional rescue operations could reach the valley. Elena's mission had transformed a certain humanitarian disaster into a manageable survival situation, saving lives through the application of skills that existed nowhere else in the world. As Elena prepared for the long flight home, she received a message from Colonel Chun that summarized the impact of her successful mission. Elena, 12 people are alive who would have died without your intervention. 63 aid workers will survive because of supplies you delivered under impossible conditions. The international humanitarian community is calling you a guardian angel, and they're not wrong. Elena looked back toward the mountains where she had spent 14 hours conducting most challenging rescue operations of her career. Somewhere in that wilderness, 51 people were warm and safe because she had been willing to risk everything to help strangers whose only crime was trying to provide medical care to people who needed it. The flight home gave Elena time to process what she had accomplished and what it meant for her future. 3 months ago, she had been Marina Castillo, a mechanic who wanted nothing more than anonymity and peace. Today, she was Elena Rodriguez, a pilot whose reputation for impossible missions was spreading through communities that dealt with emergencies conventional responders couldn't handle. She thought about the passengers aboard Flight 447, people who were alive because she had chosen to act rather than hide. She thought about Dr. Patterson and the 11 other medical professionals who would return to their families because she had been willing to fly into conditions that had defeated every other rescue attempt. Most importantly, she thought about the future missions that would inevitably come, emergencies that would require someone with her unique combination of skills, equipment, and determination to save innocent lives. Elena Rodriguez had found her purpose again, and that purpose was worth every risk she had taken to preserve it. When she landed at her home base in Oregon, Elena was met by reporters who wanted to interview the pilot whose humanitarian missions were making international headlines. But she declined their requests, maintaining the privacy that allowed her to focus on capabilities rather than celebrity. Elena Rodriguez was back in the world, but on her own terms and for causes that justified the risks she took. Somewhere, other emergencies were developing that would require someone willing to fly into impossible conditions to save people who couldn't save themselves. And when those calls came, Phoenix would be ready. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.